Welcome to the Baltimore County Coalition's third annual Community Outreach Forum. On the next slide, you're going to see that we have a very full agenda this morning. And our agenda includes our amazing guest speakers, as well as some coalition updates. Before we transition to the program, we want to pause and pay respect to the land that is at the center of our work. We are on stolen, unceded land of the Piscataway Kainai Nation, which was worked by Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved at Hampton Plantation. We humbly offer our respects to the elders, past and present. We remember and honor the Indigenous ancestors and stewards of the land on which we live, work, and prosper. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we occupy as an act of resistance against the erasure of their and our collective histories. We acknowledge just how deeply the roots of colonialism, racism, sexism, and inequality run in this country. As the land acknowledgement suggests, it is important to recognize our collective histories and lean into the work to understand the ways that the past informs our present, as well as that of our future generations. The Baltimore County Coalition was established in January of 2020. We work together to honor victims of racial terror lynching in the county and confront the legacy of racial injustice experienced by the Black community. We work to expose the history and the continuing menace of systemic racism. We work towards advancing our vision for social justice. Today, we will learn about Howard Cooper's lynching in 1885 and the ripple effect that racial terror has had on our shared communities over the ensuing 137 years. We will consider how space and place can be sites for healing, while simultaneously continue to hold pain. Today is an opportunity to learn and to grow. Two announcements before we begin. One, in order to eliminate background noise, please confirm that your computer is on mute. Second, we invite you to use the chat if you have questions for our speakers or if you have resources you want to share. Together, we will continue to build our community. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Will Schwartz, the founder and director of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. Welcome, Will.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy. Thanks. And good morning, everybody. I wanted to just kind of give you the Reader's Digest version of the Howard Cooper story, because that really is where everything emanates from. And for those who may not have seen it yet, I did want to show you the actual marker that we had installed May 8th of last year. The story of Howard Cooper's story really starts on April 4th of 1885, when he, a woman by the name of Katie Gray, a young woman about 21 years old, dropped her sister off at the station, at the train station that used to be and right across from the Valley Inn on Falls Road there. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that. Right across the street, there's a home that was a train station at that time. And Katie dropped her sister off and was on her way back to her family's farm when she encountered Howard Cooper. And it's clear that they knew each other. We know that because she was able to identify him subsequently, and their families had contact. I'm not quite sure what the nature is, but actually Jenny Lyles might be able to help us with that a little bit. In any case, there was some kind of an encounter in the woods, an incident, an assault, and she made her way home and told her father, and then a manhunt ensued immediately. She knew Howard Cooper, so there was a posse, a mob looking for him almost immediately, and there was no presumption of innocence. There was in the newspapers, the very next day, he was labeled a fiend, a criminal. There were assurances in the paper before he was even caught that he would be lynched once he was caught. After a few days, he was found in a building on the Edward Ryder farm. He was brought to Towson, to the jail that you know, the old county jail. The sheriff at the time, Sheriff Knight, had him transferred to Baltimore City because of the mobs that were gathering at the Towson jail. So he was transferred to Baltimore City for his own safety. And he was he was kept there and he was tried there in May. And the newspaper described the courtroom that day, I think it was May 21st, the court was crowded to suffocation. That was the in the paper. So it was obviously a very high interest event. He was found guilty of assault and rape, even though the victim did not testify that she was raped. But the importance of that is that because he was found guilty of rape, and by the way, he denied that he had raped her as well, but he did admit the assault. In any case, the conviction on rape triggered the death penalty, and the next day he was in fact sentenced to death by Judge William Stewart in that same courtroom. His attorneys, two men by the name of Weld and White, they appealed to the Maryland Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state, based on his 14th Amendment rights, which Blacks were excluded from the jury pool in Maryland, so his 14th Amendment rights had been violated. They did not really expect to win that appeal, but it did allow them to work on an appeal to the US Supreme Court, where they thought it might be more favorably received. And in fact, the Court of Appeals did turn them down, and the governor set a date for Cooper's execution, which would have been on July 31st. He was transferred back to the Towson jail. This appeal to the Supreme Court was ongoing. The work had been done. It was ready to be filed, and then, they needed money to basically to fund the appeal. And there was a campaign that was launched to raise the necessary funds, and it was led by Reverend Harvey Johnson of Union Baptist Church, about whom you're going to learn more in a few minutes. They announced that they had reached the funding goal for the appeal on Saturday, July 11th. The appeal was to be filed on Monday, July 13th. But on the night of Sunday, July 12th, bands of masked men converged at the jail. In fact, Howard's mother, Henrietta, lived on the Bosley farm, which is was at the time right adjacent to the jail property. And she had later said that she had actually heard the horsemen going by her home, and she knew what was about to happen. And so that was on Sunday evening, and because they didn't want to hang a man on a Sunday, the mob waited till just after midnight. They stormed the jail through the back door. They dragged Cooper out, and they hanged him from a sycamore tree that was just to the right of the building. The next morning, the newspaper reported that a train, which actually ran right behind the building, kind of parallel to Towson Boulevard, it slowed so that passengers on the train could view his body that was left hanging from the tree. His mother collected his remains around noon that day, and he is, we think, buried in an unmarked grave in Ruxton. And this is one of 38 known lynchings to have happened in the state. This, as many of you are aware, Maryland was the first and only state to establish a lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Cooper's lynching is going to be the subject of a public hearing in Baltimore County, probably in Towson, on June 4th, 2022. The hearing is for the purpose not only of learning about the murder, but also how the legacy of lynching continues to resonate in Baltimore County. It was clearly a traumatic event, and it's likely that stories about the incident were passed down to descendants not only of his family and neighbors, but also of the perpetrators and spectators. And so I wanted to mention now that in anticipation of that hearing, and in order to compile a more complete and accurate account of the incidents, we're launching an effort to find people who may have heard these stories, may have had them passed down. And Sue, this would be a good time if you could just drop that document into the chat. There's a kind of a release which is about this effort that we're going to launch to try and find people. We know that Baltimore's a parochial town, and there are a lot of long timers here. So we think it's very likely that there are people who know something about this incident. So one of the things I want you to do with that document is not only to understand what we're trying to do, but I'd love to if we could create a committee that could actually go out and publicize this, shake the trees, see what we can, who we might be able to find. So if you'd be interested in helping with that effort, it would be great if you could either indicate that in the chat or write to us afterwards, something, because that's really a critical part of this whole truth and reconciliation effort. Many of the names you'll see on this release are names that you'll recognize. They still, the Bosleys, the Riders, they're still around, and the DeVos. So it's quite likely that there are people out there who know something about that. And this, by the way, this is all a part of confronting the truth, right? So not only are we looking for people who have information to add, but I think this exercise will also kind of stimulate conversations about racial terror and white supremacy, and really that's what we're examining here. That's what really this is all about. Lynching was the most virulent form of method of enforcing it, but one of the reasons we remember these crimes is to help us understand and focus on the 403-year history of white supremacy in North America. It predates our independence, and we still see it in many ways, many of which we're going to learn about in this program today. Now, one of the key figures in this story was Harvey Johnson. And he was really an underappreciated figure in the history of civil rights, not only of Baltimore and Maryland, but also of the nation. And I doubt very much that there's anyone more knowledgeable about Johnson's life and contributions than our first speaker this morning, Dr. Alvin Hathaway. He is the 10th pastor of Union Baptist Church, which is the church that Harvey Johnson led. He was the fourth serving, he just retired, I believe, and he's the fourth longest serving pastor in the 169-year history of the church. He was inducted into the Morehouse College of Preachers 10 years ago. He had an audience with Pope Francis shortly after that, and he's the author of many publications and recipient of many honors. And we are honored to welcome him here this morning. Dr. Hathaway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brother Will, and good morning to everyone. It is my honor to share with you, and it's my honor to be here. Let's begin. The conversation, tension, confrontation we currently having around Black Lives Matter, police brutality, and voting rights harkens back to an era right after Reconstruction. A period in time when Black men were denied the right to vote and Black women were exposed to hostility and in a state of powerlessness. Between 1884 and 1900, more than 2,500 lynchings of Blacks were recorded, primarily in the South. Jim Crow raised its ugly head and stripped from the Black community federal protections and legal protections. In 1882, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1875, a law that prohibited racial discrimination in places of public accommodations. In 1896, the Supreme Court announced its sanction of separate but equal, the doctrine that was advanced by Plessy versus Ferguson. Against this backdrop, and supported by the sage perspective of W.B. Du Bois, who identified the Black church as a multiple site, a place of worship, theater, publishing house, school, and lodge. It was a place where values and issues were aired, debated, and disseminated throughout the Black community. Properly understood, the Black church was the source of power within the Black community. Properly led, the Black church was a force to be reckoned with. Union Baptist Church of Baltimore was founded in 1852, and this year is celebrating 170 years of ministry service to Baltimore City, the state of Maryland, and the nation. Union Baptist Church in 1865 founded the first HBCU in the state of Maryland, Bowie State University, and its initial classes were held on the church campus. In 170 years, it has had 10 senior pastors. I was honored to be his 10th. But the ministry team of Elyshia Johnson and Reverend Harvey Johnson, who was his 5th pastor, served for 50 years, shaped the ministry perspective of our church, which we call the servant church. Next slide. Let me first introduce you to Elyshia Johnson, A.E. Johnson, novelist and wife of Reverend Harvey Johnson. She published 2 novels, Clarence and Corinne in 1890, and The Hazel Family in 1894. She was the editor of the National Baptist magazine. She urged Black control of educational, financial, and religious institutions, stating that if our white brethren close their avenues to us because of this discrimination, we must create avenues for ourselves. She was, when Dr. Harvey Johnson wrote his book in 1903, she wrote the foreword, which was an amazing accomplishment for a woman in that era. In 1872, Union Baptist Church calls as its senior pastor a 29-year-old Reverend Harvey Johnson, who was born in 1843, graduated from the Wayland Seminary in 1872. He was a prolific writer of letters and sermons, pamphlets, and a book, The Nations, that I mentioned earlier, that was published in 1903, foreword was written by his wife, Elyshia Johnson. Reverend Harvey Johnson was a mentor, an organizer, a social activist, long before the word was coined as it is in our culture. During his ministry, he established 15 churches, ordained 11 ministers, helped organize the Lot Carey Baptist Foreign Mission and the Baptist State Convention, and I will discuss more in detail later, the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty. Next slide. Union Baptist Church is located at 1219 Drew Hill Avenue and was built in 1905 under the pastorate of Reverend Harvey Johnson. That was the second Union Baptist Church he had built from the ground up. William Beardsley Jr. designed the current Union Baptist Church, and it features stained glass windows by John Lafarge. In fact, people come from all around because it's one of the largest collections intact of John Lafarge windows. It's located at 1219 Drew Hill Avenue because in 1904, Baltimore City was destroyed by a great fire, and much of downtown was either destroyed or condemned. The Black community was then located near what we know as now Mercy Hospital, and was directed to the west of McCullough Street, but they couldn't live on McCullough Street. Hence, Union Baptist Church built its main sanctuary on Drew Hill Avenue, as I stated earlier, in 1905. Next slide. What this caused was Union Baptist Church moving in 1905 caused what is now known as the largest historic African-American district in America. And you'll find many luminaries that lived there, many illuminates that were drawn there and attracted there by Union Baptist Church and these other amazing churches, Sharp Street, Bethel, AME, and then these other communities that populated this area. Schools were birthed, businesses were birthed. Much was done because this now community was thriving, and it had its own ecosystem of economics where it supported one another, and it was able to support causes of which it was interested in. And you had here Reverend Harvey Johnson, now the leader, now the general of this movement that occurred here in West Baltimore. Next slide. Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson served as the pastor of Union Baptist Church for 50 years, from 1872 to 1923. If we would put him in context, Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson was to his era as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was to our civil rights movement. He was well known. As I mentioned, his wife was the editor of the Baptist magazine, and therefore he had a national platform upon which he could issue his talks and make his presence known, and his ideas were heard throughout the country. I think of him because I think of him in the context of a servant leader. Robin Greenleaf called a servant leader, it says, quote, leadership means that one individual has a better than average sense of what should be done now and is willing to take the risk today. Let us do this now. The consensus and the process of consensus is followed up to the point where some individual, it must be some catalytic spark that takes the risk, a leap of faith. And that's what Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson was. He was that catalytic force that took the risks. He was a true servant leader. Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson was held in high esteem by the black lawyers of his day. And this picture depicts him standing in the front of his house at 1725 Drew Hill Avenue. There he is with those mutton chop beards standing there in the center at the top steps. And all of the black lawyers of that day are there surrounding him because what Reverend Johnson did was he had the first black lawyer admitted to the Maryland State Bar in March 19th of 1885. And that was attorney Edward J. Waring, who had graduated from the Howard University School of Law. Next slide. That's all Harvey Johnson needed. He understood that law and the legal system must accrue to the benefit of people who were of African origin. And here he has in 1883, 4 members of Union Baptist Church. They make a journey on a steamship line from Norfolk, Virginia, from Baltimore to Norfolk, Virginia. And they were the Stewart sisters, Martha, Winnie, Mary, and Lucy. They had purchased first-class tickets, but they were not allowed to sleep in the first-class accommodations. In fact, they were directed to sleep with the cattle below the deck. They refused. They informed Reverend Harvey Johnson, and he hired an attorney, Archibald Pinchback, to file suit for damages. The case was heard at the federal court. Can you imagine? Here are these 4 beautiful, brilliant women being discriminated against on a steamship line, and they sue the steamship line. They sue it, and it goes to federal court, and they win that case, and they receive as a award $100 apiece. They had paid $3 apiece for the ticket. But what this case did, what this case described, was that it first established the legal precedence of test case strategy. This legal precedence of test case strategy is the strategy that was used successfully in future generations in housing discrimination. When you would send one ethnic group and then another ethnic group and discover that they are discriminated against. It's used for the American Disabilities Act. When a person would come to a building and find that they don't have access, and then as a result, they would test that. And they would then, test case strategy has been used, but it was founded by the mind of Reverend Harvey Johnson and has been an important civil rights tool ever since. The second thing that this case did was that it caused Negroes to not be chattel in interstate commerce. Negroes had been thought of as property, but now this law established at the federal level that Negroes were not property, they were not chattel in interstate commerce. And then the third thing that it did, it hit at the heart of the inequality of the doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson of separate but equal. This case hit right at that. And later on, you will find that Justice Thurgood Marshall would use this case, would cite this case in his argument of Brown versus Board of Education. Next slide. Now, after the success of the Stew case, now Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson has the vision. I need to create an organization. And in June 22 of 1885, Reverend Johnson invited 5 of his closest religious confidants to his study at 775 West Lexington Street and unveils to them the charter for the creation of the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty, with its stated goal to use all legal means within our power to procure and maintain our rights as citizens of this common country. Reverend Johnson was convinced that through the legal process, the rights of blacks could be secured and protected. As citizens of the United States of America, black Americans could exercise all the rights the United States Constitution afforded them. At their founding convention, Frederick Douglass would come and he would be their featured speaker. Frederick Douglass was a contemporary, was a friend. They had many letters, and I've read many of them, that was exchanged between the Reverend Harvey Johnson and Frederick Douglass. In fact, I read letters that was exchanged between W.B. Du Bois and Reverend Harvey Johnson. He was a prolific writer, and it was well known throughout all the circles of that day. And that takes us to this next slide. Just imagine, June the 12th, 1885, Reverend Dr. Johnson creates the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty. And as Will Schwartz talks about that next month, you have this case. It started in May, and now it has this case where Howard Cooper is sentenced to be hung. Before that, he had experience in appealing, because you saw that experience with the suitcase. He took it all the way to the federal level. And so Harvey Johnson was well known within the community. When Harvey Johnson came, that meant that something was going to happen. And he then issued a circular. And that circular was in the papers, and it was saying that they were raising funds to appeal this case of Howard Cooper. And they were prepared and had raised the money. July the 2nd, they were fully vested and was ready, as Will Schwartz indicated, to present their case for the appeal. They had raised the funds. But then you find on that fateful night, there you find that Howard Cooper was hung there July the 13th, 1885. That was devastating to the community. It was devastating to Harvey Johnson. And you will find that Harvey Johnson learned from that experience. Next slide, please. I was so proud to be a part of the installation of that marker there in Towson, there in front of the courthouse, the Howard Cooper marker. It is writing and fitting that our governor exonerated and Howard Cooper, who was unjustly found guilty and, of course, was illegally hung. I'm so glad that Towson and this lynching project is causing us to remember, but also allowing us to develop a roadmap for the future of how we can have critical conversations, of how we can nurture relationships across social, economic, and geographical boundaries, knowing that we are all one humanity, knowing that we are part of this great mosaic, knowing that we are truly one people. Next slide. Here you have, I would say, the seminal case of Reverend Harvey Johnson. This was a case, Jones versus United States. This was a case where, in that day, they would collect African Americans, Negroes. They were called there on Pratt Street. They would load them on a ship, and that ship would go to an island, Navassa. And there was this island. They would harvest what is known as pigeon dung. They would harvest that, and you can imagine this grueling, dirty, low-paying work, harvesting pigeon dung on this island. The men were treated inhumanely, and in September the 14th, 1889, a supervisor, Charles Roby, threatens the workers once too many times with a revolver, and a fight breaks out. And after the melee, 6 of the company's officers were dead. The men were then shackled. They were bound, and the men were marched down Pratt Street in chains. And the trial began in November 18, 1889. The trial lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, and George Keyes was found guilty of first-degree murder. There was a series of trials that didn't conclude until February the 20th, 1890. And 3 men, Keyes, Henry Jones, Edward Smith, were sentenced to hang for murder. 14 others were convicted of manslaughter, and 23 for rioting. The case was carried to the Supreme Court. They understood something. They understood that they could appeal. And now they appealed this case to the Supreme Court in Jones versus United States. And on October the 30th, 1890, Everett Warren, who I had indicated earlier that Reverend Harvey Johnson had got admitted to the Maryland bar, he argues before the Supreme Court in this case, the first Negro lawyer to speak before the court. They lost the appeal, and the execution was set for May 15th, 1891. But as I said to you, Reverend Harvey Johnson had learned the lesson. So Reverend Harvey Johnson, with his colleague out of Washington, D.C., Reverend Walter Brooks, and a few others, they did something unimaginable. They met with the President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, on April the 1st, 1891. And their boldness, their holy boldness, caused President Harrison to commute the sentence of hanging to life imprisonment. Later, W.B. Du Bois, in 1905, seeing the work of Reverend Harvey Johnson and the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty, would call people together there in Niagara. And later in 1906 at Harper's Ferry, he would model what we now know as the NAACP, and the principles and the strategies of the Mutual United Brotherhood now take on a national appeal. Next slide. Reverend Harvey Johnson, he sued for many things. He sued for the rights for equal pay. He conducted suits. He reasoned that Negroes didn't live in alleys, so he sued and changed all the names of alleys in Baltimore City to become streets. But he got tired. It's now 1910. Many years of struggle, many years of litigation, many years of protests. Reverend Harvey Johnson came to the conclusion that Black Americans should have their own state, their own government, and separate from white America. He developed a plan for the National Texas Purchase Movement Association. And in 1910, its purpose was organized for the specific purpose of bringing about a permanent settlement between the colored people and this government. The formation of this association, whose final objects are independence and free government, a government that will perpetuate liberty, friendship, and justice. I have an original copy of the bylaws and constitution. I have the copy of his plan. He had planned for this to be financed, that acquisition of Texas to be financed over 100 years. And I remember one time at a conversation I said, and this was in 2010, this was right in the middle of the administration of President Barack Obama. I said, my goodness, just think, if Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson had been successful in the purchase of Texas, right now in 2010, we would have paid it off. And not only would I have been the not only would I have been the pastor of Union Baptist Church, I would have also been the governor of Texas. Wouldn't that have been a great thing? Next slide. This brilliant man, now 50 years and served from 1872 until 1922. 50-year anniversary, held in high esteem. They realized that they needed to give him his flowers while he could see them. And they had a week-long celebration. Reverend Walter Brooks from D.C., 16th Baptist Church, his dear colleague and friend, of whom is the grandfather of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham there at Harvard University. He comes and he gives oratory, he gives laudatory statement. Many lawyers come and give the political establishment comes, the business community establishment. It was wonderful music because the orchestra, the Negro orchestra was playing. And they give him his flowers there while he could smell them. And then, next slide. January 1923. At a communion service, Reverend Harvey Johnson makes this statement that this cup is heavy, and he dies. You have here this obituary that says that Dr. Johnson saw the need of colored lawyers at the bar and had them admitted. He saw the need of teachers in colored schools and placed them there. His life was brimful of labor and service for others. No need is there for a monument to such a giant character. His church, his denomination, his community tell more eloquently than words of the life of a great citizen. Next slide. Dr. Over, who was the sixth pastor of Union Baptist Church, unveils a monument to Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson at his gravesite, then in Laurel Cemetery. And here you had this amazing man who is connected to the story of Harold Cooper because he took a risk. He understood that servant leadership means that you take a risk for that which is right. And the epics of our world has been changed. You may not know his story, but you feel the ramifications of his efforts because he was one who believed in God and believed in the best of his fellow man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hathaway. I don't know if anyone has already had entered questions in the chat because I couldn't really see it. Sue, I asked to maybe pass those along, but I did want to ask you, Dr. Hathaway. I noted that the United Brotherhood was formed on, was it June 12th?
Yes, yes, 1885.
Yeah, so 10 days earlier, there had been a lynching in Westminster.
Yes.
Towson Cook, and I wondered, did that enter into the thinking at all? Do you have any?
Yes. Well, one of the things that, as you know, Reverend Harvey Johnson reasoned that he could use the law and the legal system for justice, and he was seeing so much injustice, and the lynchings being one. But he had a comprehensive strategy. I get African Americans admitted to the bar. I have them now represent us in cases and matters. And he was ready to launch. And so you see him there. Yes, there was these lynchings that were before, but you see him now launching the effort there with Howard Cooper. And then in successful years, you see the success of the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty.
Thank you. Were there any other questions, Sue? Or,
Will, Carol had one quick question about whether or not a lot of this information is archived in, whether or not there's an online or curated archive of issues of Baptist Magazine.
In what magazine? Yeah. Well, if
the
you,
Baptist Magazine. They're
yes,
archived.
Yes. In fact, quite honestly, I have every edition that Amelia Johnson edited of the Baptist Voice, the Baptist Magazine, but also the NAACP. Also, much of it is in the Afro Ledger. That was the paper that Harvey Johnson, Reverend Alexander created. That was the precursor of the Baltimore Afro News American. So you'll find some of that there. Of course, you find some in the Historic Society. My dear friend Dennis Halpin did an amazing book on the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty. Their professor of history from University of Virginia.
Yeah, and I highly recommend it. By the way, it's a great book. So thank you so much again for doing this for us today. It's really illuminating, and it's an honor to have you in our presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to introduce Justin DePrima, who will be unveiling exciting news about the Racial Justice Poetry Contest. Justin joined the coalition 1 year ago, actually after attending last year's Community Outreach Forum. He's a middle school language arts teacher in Baltimore County and a PhD candidate in the Language, Literature, and Culture program at UMBC. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you for that introduction, Amy. I'd like to begin by briefly sharing a little bit about how the Racial Justice Poetry Contest came to be. Last year, I was required to teach middle school remotely. I quickly learned two hard truths about that. Students at home struggle to stay engaged, and the impact of social inequities on education are exacerbated in that setting. So to address at least the first truth, I asked my students what they wanted to learn about. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they wanted to learn about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement and what inspired that movement and the events that led up to that movement. And by introducing that subject matter into my English classroom, students were much more engaged, and they started churning out some of the best writing that I've seen from them. Some of the students produced exceptional poetry on subjects of racism today. And I asked Will Schwartz whether or not we could give those students an opportunity to share their poems at one of our coalition's events. And he was kind enough to allow them to do that. And so what really resulted was a collaboration between a handful of my students, the work of some people at an incredible arts organization downtown called Do More Baltimore, DEWMOR Baltimore, and a public event commemorating the life of Howard Cooper in July. And at that event, some of my students shared their poetry. And so I asked one of my students if she would be kind enough to record the poem that she shared at that event. And we're going to play that for you now.
Hello, my name is Isabel Stump-Cole, and I will be reading We Sing the Song of Truth and Reconciliation. Tradition says difference is not a thing of beauty, but isn't tradition just one voice of the dead? I prefer a more nuanced understanding of the past and to not give in to the stagnant voice of the stubborn. Together, it's obvious my generation is tired of the echoes, tired of being forced to listen to the same insensitive murmur from white faces, the same white faces printed in our history textbooks. These voices, like nooses, tie us to trees, yet these trees have roots that ground us in a different story, a story told by Black voices to which we weep, songs they sang from the plantations, songs of sadness, but songs of strength. They've taken hurtful words and thrown them into the mix of blues, jazz, and rap, played on repeat and becoming a familiar tune, riding on the lips of this generation. The verses include names of victims of racism, played, repeated, so their stories aren't forgotten. Let them ring out. Howard Cooper, Emmett Till, Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many other names who are part of the chorus. Sometimes I wish I could sing here anonymously. Hands reach out to silent my song, and I remember it's a risk to be bold. The pain is no longer abstract. It hovers above the heads of my generation and seeps into our hearts, and the air begins to taste like salty tears. But what is the point of living if we don't let life affect us? We've begun to sing out a more honest past and ask new questions that make ears buzz with new voices. We can change the tune, the unity of a chorus giving us strength. Hug these words close, because the truth is hard to embrace, but worth embracing. Thank you.
From the beginning of the poem, I hope you see that it's clear that students do have insightful perspectives on issues of racism today in our country and in our county. Therefore, I am very excited to announce that we will be, and we are ready to launch our racial justice poetry contest. This contest will be provided, or the information of this contest will be provided via a link in the chat. So if you are interested and you can go to that link now, you can follow along, or Amy, if you could share your screen and have the website up, excellent. You can find on the homepage there that the homepage teaches students about the lynching of Howard Cooper and reinforces the coalition's belief that painful events of our local history must be acknowledged as a step towards racial healing and racial justice. Therefore, the prompt asks students to compose a poem that expresses a perspective on or personal experience with racism. Winners of this contest will receive $100 cash, publication of their poems on our webpage, an invitation to read their poems at the July event this summer, 2022, and a free recitation workshop with the people at Do More Baltimore. If there are any educators among us, I am leading 2 webinars to help prepare students for that type of poetry writing. There is one on February 19th and a second on March 19th. On February 19th, it's more introductory and how to help students build a culture of conscience with poetry. And the second one in March is more specific to the poetry contest, where I'm providing learning activities and lesson plans that would introduce students in ways that I found successful in my classroom, 2 issues of racism today for which they may want to write about. And the contest details are given on the second tab. It is for all 8th graders, whether they're in Baltimore County public schools or private schools, the independent schools. There are some details about eligibility there, and a button for them to submit their poem. There's frequently asked questions, and also I want to ask Amy to click the top entries for 2021. And that's where you can find the poem that we saw at the beginning of with the song, We Sing the Song of Truth and Reconciliation. Other poetry that was shared last year is also available on that page, in a photo gallery of photos taken by Barbara Waters at the event. So to conclude, I just want to say that I'm excited about this contest, and that what I appreciate most about it is that it does expose these grim truths. However, it does so in a way that uplifts student voices and really showcases their excellence, which is really important in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Justin. I know, Amy, before you continue, I just wanted to mention, make sure people understand why this is an 8th grader oriented contest. The EJI, as many of you may know, sponsors a racial justice essay contest, in coordination with the marker thing, but that was only open to 9th to 12th graders. And we asked to have it open to 8th graders because Howard Cooper himself would have been an 8th grader at the time he was murdered. But EJI was resolute in limiting it to high school students. So we created this. Justin had the idea of creating this wonderful contest, and it's been spectacular. I mean, the event over the summer was magical, to tell you the truth. It was just wonderful, and I can't thank Justin enough for all the work that you've put in to make this thing happen. And we're looking forward to this year's version.
Yep. Justin, thank you so much. And Will, thank you for elaborating on it. Again, we'll put the video, Izzy's video up on the Baltimore County Coalition website. And Spice, I think you summarized it perfectly. She sounds so eloquent. And now Troy Williams, one of our co-leaders of the coalition, is going to introduce our next speaker. Troy?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Good morning, everybody. I am very pleased and excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Elyshia Aseltine. I'm sorry. The work that Dr. Aseltine is doing is very exciting for a number of reasons, but in particular, the congruence that it has with the administration's interest in ensuring equitable outcomes in public safety. We've taken a look at equity in policing, and now we're also beginning to examine the continuum of the criminal justice system here in the county and how we can ensure equitable outcomes. So this is a very timely discussion. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Aseltine. Dr. Aseltine is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminal Justice at Towson University, and the current recipient of the Martha A. Mitten Professorship. Her research focuses on racial disparities in the perceptions and punishment of crime. In her talk, Dr. Aseltine will expand on themes from Will Schwartz's, our very own Will Schwartz, 2009 documentary, Outrage in Rockland, the lynching of Howard Cooper, and highlight some of the contemporary legacies of lynching in our criminal justice system. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Aseltine, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. I am really honored to be a part of this conversation and the conversations that will undoubtedly ensue after our event today. So, and thank you, Troy, for the wonderful introduction. As Troy mentioned, one of the things that I'm really interested in covering in this talk is thinking about the legacies of lynching. So there's often this intentional denial that history matters in terms of our contemporary practices. And that's just not true. And so what I want to do is try to trace some of the threads from the kind of era of lynching to contemporary moments, especially as it relates to the criminal justice system. So I think I can click the slides myself. Is that true? Or not? Okay, let me see. Okay, next slide, then we'll do that. Again, as Troy mentioned, I used the documentary, so Will Schwartz's 2019 documentary about the Howard Cooper lynching as my starting point. So there are a number of things that he mentions in the documentary that I want to kind of pull out and expand upon. I've included the link there at the bottom, but I believe there's plans also to share the link to the documentary in the chat if you haven't had the chance to see it. But essentially, what I want to do is demonstrate that even if history may not repeat itself, it certainly rhymes, right? That there are resonances in terms of ideas that move into the contemporary times. And I think you could probably go to the next slide, actually. There are ideas that travel through time, and one specific idea that I'll be talking a bit more about are stereotypical notions about Black men and about Black boys. And then the other theme that I'm going to be focusing on is the mechanisms by which we perpetuate forms of racial terrorism that rhyme with lynching in a so-called colorblind society. So the idea is that racism shifts its form, but not necessarily it's the undergirding notions that support racism. And the challenge that we have in our contemporary moment is how to reveal racism in a society that really disguises it and has distinct discomfort in talking about race. So disguises it through so-called race neutral practices and race neutral language. So we can go to the next slide. And what I want to talk about as a starting point is the racialization of Black men. So racialization in this context is the imposing of race or racial meaning onto human bodies, onto objects, and onto behaviors. So in my courses, I teach a race, crime, and justice course. One of the first activities that I have students do is identify the way that we racialize all kinds of things that are seemingly race neutral. So sports activities, types of cars, types of dogs, types of clothing, right? So we apply racial meaning to all these things that don't have inherent racial meaning, right? But become meaningful in the context of our applying racial meaning to them. And we do the same thing with people, of course, right? We categorize people based on what characteristics we have decided are important in determining racial categories. And one of the most distinct forms, especially for the purposes of our conversation today, is the racialization of Black men. And in the documentary, there's a point where there's reference to Howard Cooper as a brute. And even Schwartz, when he was Will, when you were doing your introduction at the beginning, you mentioned newspapers referring to Howard Cooper as a fiend. And this language, especially this language of brute, may not have the same resonance today that it did historically. I have to apologize. Childcare fell through because of COVID. And so you're probably going to hear the voice of a little one in the background. So I'll do my best to keep them entertained. But references to Howard Cooper as a brute. And what this meant at the time was it captured a number of themes of ways of thinking about Black men as innately savage, animalistic, destructive, and criminal. So this brute captured all of these kinds of notions about Black masculinity. And not only in terms of imagining Black men as animalistic and dangerous, but linking this with interpretations around sexual pathology, and especially this perceived appetite for white women. So in the next slide, we can go ahead and go to that. I'm just going to give you kind of a couple examples of what I mean by this that are written kind of in this historical context. So this first example is from Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, first version published 1781. So we're still in the context of slavery. And he's describing what he perceives to be kind of innate differences between white and Black people. And there's a few things, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but what I tried to do was italicize some of the things that I think are really important for the purposes of our conversation. So he talks about Black people requiring less sleep, about them being induced by the slightest amusements, about them having a want of forethought, right? So kind of an inability to anticipate consequences or the future based on their actions. He describes them as being more ardent after they're female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender or delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient. Their experience is much more an experience of sensation rather than reflection. So he uses, kind of artful language really to set the foundation for some of these ideas that are captured in this concept of brute. And in his writing, he doesn't quite link it to criminality yet, right? That kind of connection isn't made as explicitly, but what you can see in these discussions are the seeds of those ideas. And these seeds become really important in the context of the movement towards the end of slavery. So many of the folks that were interested in maintaining slavery, let's say, started to morph many of these arguments to say that if we don't have slavery, we're basically going to be overrun by criminality, right? That slavery is a mechanism essentially for controlling the kind of weak moral compass and composition of Black people in the US. So let's go to the next slide. And this is a post-slavery, and I put post in quotations because it doesn't end with the 13th Amendment, and we can talk more about that later if folks are interested. But because, and this is a quotation from Muhammad's book, and I put the cover there. It's an amazing book for really tracing the ideas of linking race and criminality in the United States, and not just in terms of the idea of it, but how these ideas are concretely connected with measurements of criminality. And so he's quoting a doctor who, first of all, dismisses, right, that there's any consequence, long-term consequence of hundreds of years of slavery. But he says, because the Negro is placed under exactly the same conditions, social and economic, as the white race, there is no other way to explain their mortality and criminality differences other than their race proclivity to disease and death. So now you see this conversation shifting really at the end of slavery to discussions around criminality, right? And criminality becomes essentially kind of the mechanism by which institutions can engage in social control of Black people in the forms that were achieved through slavery prior to, but now, right, essentially the criminal justice system becomes the functional replacement of the system of slavery. And so there's two mechanisms that are emerged. So one is the criminal justice system itself, and then the other is, of course, is the mechanism of lynching, right? Which people often like to think of it as an extra legal, meaning something that occurs outside of the criminal justice system. But anyone who's studied lynching, you know that oftentimes the criminal justice system was deeply implicated, right? So law enforcement personnel, judges, et cetera, were often condoning or outright participating in lynchings. So I don't want there to be this perception like this is what kind of the general population did and this is what the criminal justice system did, because they were deeply intertwined. So let's go to the next slide. The criminal justice system very much relied on, as I mentioned, and this is the argument that I've been trying to build, is relies on these ideas about, and continues to rely on these ideas about criminality and the supposed connection between Black people and criminality. And so we start to see the criminal justice system turn its attention, especially in the South, to incarcerating Black people after the end of slavery as a mechanism to push them back into plantations through convict leasing systems, to push them into working on state projects, building roads and railroads and those kinds of things for governments and for private entities, right, to expand their wealth. But key to this moment, and this is the quote right there, kind of in the middle, Black criminality has become the most significant and durable signifier of Black inferiority in white people's minds since the dawn of Jim Crow. And there's a researcher, Catherine Russell Brown, who used to be out of Florida, but I can't quite remember now where she is, coined the phrase the criminal Black man. And you can see the blending of those words is deliberate, because what she's arguing ultimately is that those components are inseparable, right? That this idea is, these ideas of Blackness, masculinity, and criminality are so intertwined that it doesn't make sense to keep the words as distinct. Let's go to the next slide. So what I want to connect it to is in this contemporary moment. So the racialization of crime in a colorblind society. So it's relatively easy to find kind of historical documents littered with these notions about criminality. But how do you identify those kinds of ideas in the context of a colorblind society where people are uncomfortable talking about race, or deliberately kind of obscuring their conversations or references to race. And in a society where there's a tremendous amount of social pressure against being racist or being called racist. There was a really interesting study that was done with undergraduates where they were asked to take a test that was supposed to determine essentially their level of racism. And they were given results, fake results of their test that indicated that they were in fact racist. And they were given an option to put their hand basically in a bag of worms, harmless worms, but gross, right? So they were given an option. Well, would you put your hand in a bag of worms in order for these results not to be revealed? And 63% of the respondents were like, yes, I would rather have my hand in a bag of worms than for people to think that I'm racist. So how do you have racism perpetuate in that kind of context, right? Where it's generally kind of castigated to be racist. And the mechanisms that we use are racial code words. So these are seemingly race neutral words that are used to tap in these very deeply historically rooted ideas about race and criminality. So we can still talk about race, but we don't have to ever even use a word that indicates like explicitly that we're talking about race. So it functions in a couple of ways. It allows people who are very resistant to seeing themselves as racist or implicated in a racist system to communicate racial ideas, but also to be able to deny that they are communicating about such ideas. So some of the racial code words that we use today, drug dealers, gangsters, gang members, and then probably the most kind of contemporarily significant one is the phrase thugs. And so just for experimentation purpose, I just Googled the word thug. And this is one of the images that came up. And if you actually go to the next slide, I'll show you what you can see in terms of all of the images. So there's a musician, Young Thug. So many of those pictures are featuring him. And then of course there's Tupac Shakur, who had the thug life tattoo right across his abdomen. So he appears there, but then you can see there on the right side, just by putting in the word thug in Google, right? The vast majority of the images are a young Black man. So these are ideas that continue to resonate with us. And so I can talk about thug and basically implicate all of these kinds of racial ideas without ever having to explore the history of those ideas with my audience without, and with some degree of certainty that they're going to know what I'm talking about without my having to say it. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about racialization, racial code words, and those ideas absolutely resonate still. So I want to go to the next slide and show you some share some research that demonstrates how these ideas resonate, not just how they resonate, but how they still impact our decision making in the criminal justice sphere. So Dr. Eberhardt is a social psychologist at Stanford, and she does research about implicit bias. And so much of her research reveals that many of the images or the kind of stereotypes that we have about Blackness are still around. So definitely with respect to our interpretations around criminality and even our interpretations around humanity, right? So she measures, conducts tests essentially to see how much people still associate African Americans with, specifically with primates. And she finds, right, statistical evidence that this is still, these are still notions that people kind of carry with her. She studies undergraduate students and police officers, interestingly enough. But she doesn't stop there. So then she goes on to essentially study how these ideas influence people's support of punitive policies in the criminal justice system. So these are like our kind of harshest punishments that we met out in the criminal justice system. So death penalty, 3 strikes policies, juvenile life sentences, and even she has studies about interpretations of police brutality, and consistently across these studies, these kinds of implicit biases influence whether people support the death penalty, whether they support juvenile life sentences, whether they interpret police brutality as justified or not. And this again is reinforced in other kinds of literature. So there's the Sentencing Project did a report around race and punitiveness, and they find that white people especially overestimate the proportion of crime that is committed by people of color, and they overestimate the proportion of people of color that actually commit crime. And in fact, one of the best predictors of the perceived severity of crime in a neighborhood is just the percentage of young Black men that are in that neighborhood. So these ideas, right, still resonate in concrete decisions we're making about criminal justice policies and practices today. Okay, next slide. The last thing I want to say about this particular idea about racialization is the impact, especially on Black children, and especially young Black males. And it's been mentioned Howard Cooper was young. He would have been, as Will mentioned, in 8th grade rather than an adult, but that was something that was discovered later on, right? So much of the newspaper coverage of him at the time and the discussion of him at the time characterizes him as an adult. And we find even these ideas are something that still resonate with us today. So Black children are still typically seen as older than they actually are, which is important, right, in terms of thinking about dangerousness, right? So adults are going to be perceived more dangerous than a child would be. So if you have children being interpreted more readily, Black children being interpreted as adults or being perceived as adults, they're perceived as more dangerous. And not only that, there was a study that was just released not too long ago, that the older an adult thinks a Black child is, the more likely they are going to interpret their behavior as angry. And there's no similar kind of perception with white children, right? So all of this kind of trickling down to even children who generally we afford more protections and concern for, right? But these protections and concerns are not afforded young Black children as they age. All right, next slide. And yes, Emmett Till. Exactly. So lynching and voting is also a theme that was mentioned by Dr. Hathaway, and also is covered in the documentary. And Will actually in the documentary argues that the seed for Howard Cooper's lynching was planted basically with the passage of the 15th Amendment. And one of the things that we know about lynching is that it was one mechanism of many, including poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, et cetera, to prevent Black political participation. And there's some really interesting research emerging out of political science around the impact of lynching. So there was one study that was interested in voter registration historically in places where lynchings occurred. And they find that if you lived in a region or area where there were higher rates of lynching, there were lower rates of voter registration historically and in contemporary times, right? So this is a pattern that still is occurring, right? Where there's this kind of lived memory, so to speak, of lynching and the discouragement of Black political participation. The other practice that I want to connect it to in the contemporary moment is felon disenfranchisement. So this is basically for people who have been convicted of felonies, their inability to participate in political processes through voting, right? So it varies from state to state in terms of the severity of felon disenfranchisement. So in some contexts, you were barred from voting ever if you've ever been convicted of a felony. In other places, it was after a certain amount of time or after you finish parole or those kinds of places. But felon disenfranchisement is absolutely rooted. I mean, its origins are as a strategy to prevent Black political participation. So the Mississippi Constitutional Convention of 1890, there's a whole record of the delegates deliberately handpicking particular types of crimes that would result in someone losing their right to vote. And they didn't include murder and they didn't include rape, in large part because white people commit those crimes. And so what they wanted to do was kind of handpick or select crimes that they thought Black people were more likely to commit, and those would be the ones that would prevent Black people from voting, right? So it was very much a deliberate strategy using the criminal justice system and a criminal record as a mechanism for preventing Black political participation. Now in the 60s, it became illegal to use it as a strategy, basically to eliminate political participation of just one racial group. And so many states just expanded it to anyone, right, that had been convicted of a felony. But because we know our criminal justice system, especially when we're talking about incarceration, is selective in who actually bears the brunt of incarceration. Felon disenfranchisement continues to be a mechanism to limit the Black vote. So in Mississippi today, 10% of the voting age population is unable to vote, and nearly 16% of Black people who are of voting age cannot vote because of a felony conviction. Next slide. Lynching and death penalty, of course, are connected. We saw it in the Howard Cooper case. He had been through basically sham kind of legal processes, been sentenced with the death penalty. And this is a good illustration, right, of the blending of the criminal justice system and lynching historically, and even to some degree today, which I'll talk about in a second. So Equal Justice Initiative has, of course, produced lots of wonderful resources around lynching. And one of the arguments that they make, and that's supported by research, is that lynching declined not because we became, as a nation, more horrified by it, right? There wasn't some like conscious awakening or a spiritual awakening about how awful this practice was. There wasn't, despite lots of efforts, and even some that Dr. Hathaway discussed, despite lots of efforts to change the legal landscape, to pass legislation nationally or even at state level, to punish or prevent lynching from happening, neither of those were the contributing factors. In fact, what ultimately results in the decline of lynching is the increased use of the death penalty. And as we see in the Cooper case and countless others, the trials that result in death penalty punishments are largely perfunctory, right? It's a kind of a symbolic ceremony where the outcome's already known, like the plot is already kind of known to the audience, but people go through this process. And it, for whatever reason, satisfies whatever a lynching had satisfied for populations, right? So we see the decline of lynching as we see the increase of the death penalty. Greg v. Georgia is actually the case where the death penalty, we had a short kind of moratorium on the death penalty for a few years where it was ruled unconstitutional for various reasons. Greg v. Georgia is the US Supreme Court case that allows us as a nation to implement the death penalty again, provided we follow these kind of reworked processes. And one of the arguments that the Supreme Court makes in their decision in Greg v. Georgia is that we need to have the death penalty, otherwise we might see the reemergence of lynching, right? So because lynching is intimately tied, both in terms of kind of justifications for the death penalty by the Supreme Court, but also in it waning in the 1930s, starting in the 1930s or so. All right, next slide. Rape, death penalty, and incarceration. So in 1977, the US Supreme Court determined that the death penalty was an unconstitutional punishment for the crime of rape. So, you know, post 1977, we're not going to have death penalty cases related to rape. It never mentions, the US Supreme Court never mentions race in its decision, although race was deeply implicated in the use of the death penalty. It was limited almost exclusively to cases involving white female victims, and particularly in Southern jurisdictions. So you can see this chart from the Death Penalty Information Center that the vast majority of people that received the death penalty were Black men. This data doesn't include the reality that many of them were Black men accused of raping white women. And that most of those executions for rape had occurred in these southern states. And in fact, no white man had ever been executed in the US for the rape of a Black woman or child. So I want to connect that with contemporary discussions about race briefly, that we know even in patterns of convictions today, right? So death penalty is no longer an option, but incarceration absolutely is. Rapes where Black male assaults, where a Black male assaults a white female are treated the most severely. So consistently, right? And in study after study, the interaction of the race of the victim and the race of the defendant is one of the best predictors, right, in terms of length of sentencing or severity of sentencing. And those cases involving Black female victims with Black male assailants receive the most lenient responses. And one of the things that I think is really important to highlight is that it's not just about the harsher punishment of Black offenders, it's about the neglect and disregard of Black victims, right, which is an important mechanism by which we can start to think about, as Justin was mentioning, the emergence of Black Lives Matter, right, and what it means to say Black Lives Matter in a context where they have consistently not mattered for generations and generations. All right, next slide. The last thing I want to end with, and I'm sure folks from my university, so I'm a professor at Towson University, would not be so pleased with this, but I think it's important to own the ways that these ideas still resonate in the ways that our institutions honestly fail, I guess, in kind of recognizing this history and engaging with it and taking responsibility and all of those things. So when I started at Towson in 2012, and my second semester, there was a series of robberies that were happening on York Road and kind of the uptown of Towson, right? So where the bars and things that students would often go to on the weekends. So lots of robberies, right? We would get all of these text messages and crime alerts from the university that were problematically vague. So it would be a text message of, two Black men wearing hoodies and jeans, just had robbed some students on York Road. And we had, at the time, it wasn't an official student organization, but you wouldn't necessarily have known that because Matthew Heimbach, who's the student at Towson featured there on the right, was excellent at engaging the media, right? So he had a kind of savviness in terms of getting the media to listen to him. And anyways, what they decided to do was they were going to create patrols on campus to protect white women. And so this is from the White Student Union's blog, talking about this Black crime wave. And I want you to look at the language, because this language is, I mean, I could probably put the Howard Cooper newspaper articles right next to each other and we could find the themes. And so he's talking about the virtue of white Christian womanhood is under attack by these in this Black crime wave, and that we essentially as God-fearing, what does he say? White Southern men, right, are being called to protect these white students on campus. And so we have, in this case, I think history might be repeating itself in many senses, right? But we can see how many of the ideas that I was trying to kind of just touch upon, and especially these ideas around racialization, still are tapped into in order to engage in racial terrorism in a society that we like to think of as colorblind. So I'm going to end there. And then I don't know if we have time for questions. So I'll take your lead, Amy, in terms of how you want to move forward.
We are going over time at this point. Troy, did you have you were managing the chat a little bit for questions. Do you have maybe one question we could at least acknowledge?
Yeah, we did. We had some kind of robust comments in the chat, but we just had a question pop in terms of Dr. Aseltine's thoughts on white fragility as defined by Robin DiAngelo in this context.
So my thoughts in terms of, well, I mean, I think that it contributes to, this is becoming one of the, we see it in the resistance, right, against critical race theory and the teaching of critical race theory, right, at the university, that there's this misunderstanding of talking about race and holding ourselves kind of accountable for history and responsible, right, for knowing that the racial history as somehow insulting or threatening, right, to white people. I'm not sure how to address it. I mean, it's something that I have to address in my courses all the time, and it takes a long time. And I have some authority over my students, at least in terms of their grades. And so I at least have, like, they have some accountability, right, to look at the materials that I assign to them. And so there is a bit of kind of coerce. I hope this doesn't go on like a alt-right kind of website, but there is some level of coerciveness just by virtue of the hierarchy of me being a professor and they being students in my classes, right? So I get to choose the materials that they're exposed to help them try to kind of face some of the ideas that they are resistant to facing. I don't know how you would do that in another context, right? And where there isn't that level of like accountability. And if you have ideas about it, I'm game to talk about them, but it's a problem, right? It's a challenge in my classrooms. It's a challenge with my colleagues, to be fair, who are educated and I respect in most senses, but then perpetuate the same kinds of discomfort. So I at least want to acknowledge, right, it's real and it's hard. Thank you, Troy.
Absolutely. No, I think to the extent that we can continue to have those challenging conversations and have them with candor, as Reverend Dr. Hathaway said earlier, I think that's critically important. And so I would love to continue the conversation with you offline on some other topics as well, because I think we talk about political disenfranchisement as a result of this legacy, but there's also considerable economic disenfranchisement as a result of this legacy too, the removal of otherwise productive individuals from the community, and then policies that have forbidden people from getting involved in economic opportunity moving forward, right, as policy change. We'll be calling on you, definitely, particularly as we start to look at the continuum of the criminal justice system here in the county. So thank you very much, and folks feel free to reach out and follow up and continue those conversations. So with that, I will be respectful of our time on the agenda and move to the next segment. Thank you, Dr. Aseltine.
And Troy, you are actually up on the agenda next. So you're gonna open up conversation about the Truth and Reconciliation Park and then pass it off to our other co-leader, Nancy Goldring.
Okay, great, excellent. And this is a very timely discussion too, particularly as it leads into our next speaker, because one of the things that has come out of this project, and I can personally attest, I have learned a tremendous amount since 2019 in negotiation and work, but more importantly, where this work extends beyond just the placement of a marker. And I think that's incredibly important. So I want to talk to you just really quickly and give you an update on where we are on some of the other projects related to this, the Lynching marker installation, particularly with respect to the Truth and Reconciliation Park. So for folks that are new, one of the things that became an outgrowth of the placement of the marker, which you will see in that lower circle at the center of the screen, which is where the marker is placed in front of the old jail complex. As we kind of move through that process, we had discussions about creating a place of healing here in the county, a place where the truth can be told and we can reflect on that truth and try to move towards some level of reconciliation and understanding the context of the world in which we live, right? And so you'll see the larger circle at the top of the screen was a proposed site, or is a proposed site, for a Truth and Reconciliation Park that will give us an opportunity to extend beyond just the placement of the marker, but to a shared community space where we can acknowledge our past and kind of reflect upon where we've been, but also begin to have those, again, candid conversations and that candor that will allow us to kind of reconcile that past and move to a place of healing and unity. And so we've presented that to the administration as a coalition. Here's another shot of that proposed park site, which is actually an existing pocket park here in the county right now. And we're looking forward to getting something developed there that will support a Truth and Reconciliation Park. There is an update in that regard though, and Will is showing us now some models of some other parks around the country that we would like to take elements of and create our own kind of location. But just as an update, the county has begun to hold meetings with coalition leadership and wanted to give them an update in terms of the fact that the county is considering the installation of a new library in that area and on that site as well. And so now we are actively in discussions to determine how to best either incorporate the design of the park into any green space that is associated with the library, or to find an alternative site for the park in the county, but also being mindful and respectful of the need to contextualize the park in terms of close location to the market. So just wanted to give folks an update that we are actively working collaboratively to understand the issues at hand and to figure out how to best move forward in the design and placement of the park. And so with that, if you want to reach out to me or reach out to the coalition, get involved in that work, or get some more clarity on anything, be more than happy to do that. I know we have a little bit of limited time right now, and I want to allow Nancy to talk to you about another exciting element of the work that we're doing around the trail, the historic trail. So I will turn it over to Nancy.
Hello, everybody. I am Nancy Goldring, another member of the leadership team for the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. So I'm actually here to speak with you today about an idea, an inspiration really, that connects Hampton Historic Site, or formerly the Hampton Plantation, to the now historic East Towson community. This, in my mind, is a 21st century pursuit of higher ground, of freedom, equality, equity, and inclusion. This is actually my family tree, which takes my family at the Hampton Plantation back to 1791. But it's important to note that that is not exactly what makes me an authority on the conversation, because I'm not the only one. Next slide. Here you see other families from the historic East Towson community, families whose descendants are actually still in this community. In the center, you have John Gross, who's standing in front of a carriage that his great-grandfather, I believe, drove for the Ridgeleys. On the left, you have Miss Genevieve, who was born at Hampton, and her granddaughter, she's since passed on, but her granddaughter still owns a house here. Here on the right, Miss Amy Davis, who lived to be 103. Her family home is still here, and her family still lives here. And Mr. Martin in the upper right corner on the front porch, that is a house that was built by his great-grandfather in 1910. Mr. Martin is 91 and the youngest of 11 children, and he still lives in his family home in historic East Towson today. On the left in the yellow t-shirt is my grandmother, who lived in East Towson for her whole 91 years, and I still live here as well. Next slide. What many of you may not know is that East Towson is a community born essentially from the freed men and women, formerly enslaved men and women from Hampton Mansion. In this slide, you see the mansion, images of enslaved children. James Pratt, one of the early citizens of East Towson. Hampton was essentially not just one of the most celebrated residences in the country, but it was also one of the largest slave labor facilities as well. Next slide. And so since essentially the community has been free, it has also been under siege. And commercial successes, not unlike Stanley Black & Decker, which was just Black & Decker at the time, the Towson Library, the BGE substation, and the district court buildings. These were all sites where Towsonites actually lived and had their businesses. Next slide. And you'll see from this slide the many instances where unwanted or ill-placed development has been coming through this community for years. And the Philadelphia Tribune article was just from this past summer. Next slide. So I was asked a couple of summers ago, if you don't want to see a 4-story, 56-unit Soviet-style intrusion, as one writer calls it, in your neighborhood, a structure that does not consider the current aesthetic of your community, it goes against the legal design standards and the environmental sensitivities, what do you want to see there? Next slide. So my first thought was, what's wrong with leaving it the way it is? And this is the way it is. It's currently the last remaining green space in Towson between here and White Marsh, unless you consider the Prospect Hill Cemetery. Next slide. However, I didn't say that. I said, well, why not a trail that connects historic East Towson back to its beginning, which is Hampton Plantation? Next slide. And so a lot of that was born out of a new understanding of the environmental issues that come along with developing the plot of land, where the plot of forested land that you just saw. Next slide. And so you say to yourself, oh, what could go wrong? It's a steep inclining piece of property. It acts right now as a kind of sponge for stormwater runoff in the community and does its share to at least minimize flooding. It certainly doesn't stop it. Next slide. And this is what already can happen because that property is situated at the headwaters of the Herring Run, and any kind of building an impervious surface creates flooding that runs downstream, and this is some of what has happened. So we see the 5 miles that connects Hampton to historic East Towson as an opportunity, not just to contemplate the journey of freedom for former slaves, but to also consider freedom in our own lives and as it evolves in our own consciousness. Next slide. And so you say, well, what's the difference? I often had only a conceptual sense of the difference between equity and equality. And so in Towson, we are anticipating that this trail that connects us back to our origin and the origin story of Towson itself will bring about a new relationship to freedom, equality, equity, and inclusion. You'll see that in the image, if you just consider it from a vantage point of equality, you get one outcome. But with equity, everybody gets to enjoy the game. It is a game-changing conversation. And the county has protected 300 acres of green space in Perry Hall, 24 and a half acres of green space in Lutherville Timonium, and that property isn't headed anywhere. It isn't being protected for any other reason except that that's what the people want. This is a fantastic opportunity for, it's a fantastic environmental, ecological, educational opportunity. And I must say before I go, thank you to the Sierra Club, the TUUC, the Towson University, the Towson Green Towson Alliance, and even the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, and a whole host of private citizens who are very committed to this project and seeing the space come to a much, how I might say, higher resolution for not just historic East Towson, but the community at large. Thank you.
Nancy, can I just add something here? I think this is a brilliant idea, and one that I hope that we pursue as a coalition and help with. But I think one thing that is unstated but should be called out is that something like this would also help balance the inequity between the Hampton Mansion, which is a National Historic Site, and the beneficiary of tens, hundreds, lots of money, right? And a community that it would connect to, which has been plundered, as you pointed out. So I think this is an important step in that direction as well, and to help people understand that this inequity exists and is itself an expression of white supremacy. That's all.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
Sure.
And I'd like to, the great thing about presenting this idea to you is it comes right before our next guest, which is Dr. Khalima Young. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Khalima Young. She's the assistant professor in the Department of Electronic Media and Film at Towson University, where she has created a project known as Invisible Architecture. It's a multi-year interdisciplinary container designed to create avenues for projects and programs that reinscribe the voices of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant populations in the narrative of Towson University's origin story. An important element of the project is understanding how public spaces can reflect the history of racial trauma and express public and collective grief. Welcome, Dr. Khalima Young.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for your awesome work with this Freedom Trail. We're really excited to learn more and see how our project can be in collaboration with your project and see if we can work together. Hi, everyone. I will try to bring us home in a neat enough place. And before before talking about Invisible Architectures, the project itself, I want to first steep the conversation in an understanding of memory, place, and space. One of my research interests is I look at the impact of race and gender-based trauma on Black identity formation and Black cultural production. I also like to explore, it's a part of it, to explore how do we do grief? How do we do pain in public? What does it mean to collectively gather, collectively create space where we can deal with the frictive moments in society? Environmental academic Anna Zing has this conversation, this concept called friction. She says, one stick alone is just a stick, but when you rub two sticks together, you create heat and light. In friction and in our most frictive moments, we have some of our most generous productivity as a people. And that's the position in which I'd like us to start thinking about some of these concepts of memory, place, and space. You can go to the next slide. So one of the things I want to bring attention to is this idea of memory. We have shifted over the years, since the last 30 years or so. Our conversation about memory has shifted. And I love this quote by Andreas Heisen. The obsessive pursuit of memory may be an indication that our thinking and living temporality, like time, are undergoing a significant shift. As modernity has brought about a real compression of time and space, right? We can get things faster. We can move through things quickly. We can work through things. We can travel from one space to the other in the space of modernity. But it's also expanded our understanding of time and space as well. So the way that I like to break that down is to think about it this way. History is not static, nor is it stable. Now, memory is without borders rather than a national history within borders. So when we think about Confederate monuments, when we think about those conversations, they're all about nation building, right? Creating the sense of collective memory. Well, that is not a static conception. We can tell, right? At one point, it was gauche to have the rebel flag. And then in the 1950s and 60s, as the pushback about civil rights, suddenly it became something about pride. So memory is without borders at this moment. Things change, conceptions of space change. And today's memory is understood as a mode of representation and as belonging to the present and as something that is subject to shift depending on who has the floor, who has the mic. There are micro memories and micro adjustments to our understanding of our concept of memory as people within this nation. So we are currently in a battle for cultural memory. If anybody who's been paying attention to the kerfluffle about critical race theory and the distortion of critical race theory, we know that we're in this space where we're having a battle for cultural memory. This picture is by artist Jonathan Harris. He stands there next to the portrait, and that's his painting that he created called Critical Race Theory, which really gets to sort of the nugget of what's going on in this conversation. People have lived this history, and other people are working to erase it. Often history is about the victors, and self-aggrandizing monuments are created to the victors. And in the 19th century, it was used to legitimize the nation state. These things may still be present in the monuments that we create, but the cultures to which they speak have become infiltrated by the repressed and by group memories and by reimaginings and retellings. They've been subverted by forgotten micro-histories. So when we think about Dr. Alvin Hathaway's discussion, forgotten histories or minimized histories, those micro-histories, which are really major for some groups of people, are now starting to be reinscribed into our cultural imagination, and we need to make space for those things within our monuments and memorials. Those who bear witness to personal and historic traumas, and by the transformation of monuments and into spaces, carry the weight. These are the people who must carry the weight of how we organize space for collective grief and collective trauma. You can go to the next slide. So Nancy Goldring's presentation, she said, rooted in the soil. And I was like, yeah, exactly. This is what I'm getting at. Trauma lives in the soil and in our memory. And we have to think about it in two different ways. When we think about place, we're talking about a feeling. It's an embodied space. It's a feeling of connection and identity and cultural, personal connection to something. And when we're thinking about space, we're talking about the location, the geography, the physical makeup of the space. It's a very measurable thing. You can GPS it, you can plot it on a map. And when we think about how trauma lives in the soil, trauma lives in the soil of a space. And this also shapes the place of this location, right? So it lives in the geographical space, but it shapes the place that it hangs out in our memories. So places where traumas occur, like the location where Hooper was lynched, carry memory. You can practically feel it in the soil. When you think about the ways that people activate space, it's because trauma is continuing to live in that area because an occurrence has occurred. People have a cultural memory that's attached to it, and you can mark it on a map. Next slide, please. So when we're trying to hold space in places for trauma, it goes through we have two different approaches you have to think about. So remembering is tied to space and objects. Anybody who has ever done a memory map or made a memory palace knows this, right? We understand where we are by locating where objects are and creating a connection to space and objects. In this process, we emphasize place and organize ourselves around that place. So we identify the object or the location, we organize around that place. And then we focus on the trauma that's collective and in that locale to organize a space that invites others to engage with the event. What we're doing when we activate a place that has held trauma is we are inviting people to engage in a space of cultural memory, to add to the cultural memory that makes that an actual place. Next slide. So one of the things that's really important as we think about, well, how do we activate places in and around Towson, right, that have experienced trauma? As we have to think about the differences between what it means to have a monument and what it means to have a memorial. A memorial may be a day or a space. As you can see, when Prince died, boom, memorial, right? It's like those balloons and teddy bears on the side of the road where someone has lost their lives. It's the white bikes that are there, right? A memorial may be a day or a space, but it need not be a monument. A monument, on the other hand, is physically static. A memorial is often erected to honor those who have died, including spontaneous memorials that we see in the aftermath of a tragedy. Memorials are ephemeral. So a monument has space, but memorials are ephemeral. Next slide, please. But the important thing to think about as we talk about activating and holding space is that all memorials or monuments become public spaces for dialogues that cannot always be controlled. So as you think about your walking tours, how are you going to control the dialogue? As you think about your markers, how do you control the dialogue? How do you invite people into a rich understanding of the cultural memory of the place, what it means, while also respecting that you've just created a space where a lot of frictions might just occur. Next slide, please. I've been involved in a lot of different projects that look at sort of memorials and monuments. One of the things I want to talk about is one of the projects that I was involved in was created by Force Upsetting Rape Culture, and it was called the Monument Quilt. And over a 7-year period, we collected over 3,000 quilt squares from survivors of sexual violence, and we blanketed across the National Mall in 2018. So one of the things that I like to think about when I think about how we build a space to hold frictions is you have to invite collective engagement. A space is not just for silent and symbolic sites of memory, but it's a space where we need to have active dialogue. The premise is that a memorial that truly speaks to traumatic memories, not only of the past, but of today, should come to exist through a process of engagement with the communities who share a vital connection to it. You cannot create a space without having the folks who have been involved, helping to shape that space. And the key issue for creating a work memorial is that you understand that it's not just historical, history is alive, that the histories of the traumas that perpetuated it are ongoing, and that a memorial, even if it's about death, is not about death. It's about what's happening in the productivity of that death at this moment. You can go on to the next slide. So one of the ways that we're grappling with this is a project that I am the co-director of at Towson, called Invisible Architectures. It's going to run from 2021 to 2024, 3 years of intense work. So at TU, one of the ways we're trying to hold space and place and space for trauma, such as the White Student Union and the Hampton Plantation, is through a reckoning with the origin story and the archive of the institution through this CoLab project. So it's called the COFAC CoLab project. It's a part of the Center of Fine Arts and Communications, of which I'm a part of, my department. And I'm working in concert with arts education professor Ada Pinkston to create these series of projects that are about holding space for place and trauma and the origin story of Towson as a university. You can move on to the next slide. So a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or Truth and Justice Commission is an official body tasked with discovering and revealing the past wrongdoing by a government in the hope of resolving conflict over time. And Invisible Architectures is inspired by this movement. What are we saying about ourselves at Towson University? How are we acknowledging the land that we're on and the land that we're continuing to gentrify? What are we doing to acknowledge the root shock that East Towson community has experienced because of the displacement and the continued building over of space? How are we going to reckon with it? Over the next 3 years, we're going to try our darndest. You can go into the next slide. So through this project, we have 3 objectives. We're going to reimagine the archive of Towson University and other University of Maryland institutions and partner universities. How are we talking about the Black, Brown, and Indigenous people that have been central to making that space work, who have contributed to the growth of those spaces, who are contesting those spaces, who are pushing back against violence that occurs in those spaces? And how do we make sure we have a clear archive that tells us this story? We're also about working to develop tools and resource for the future at the university that's grounded in truth and reconciliation. Students who come into this institution, faculty who come and work in this institution need to understand its relationship to trauma, its relationship to space, and its relationship to the harms and the moments of friction that have actually created new ways of being. So you can go into the next slide. So each year in this project at Towson, we're going to have a different focus. Our first year is about place. So we're having a project called Critical Confabulations, where there will be a large scale projection on buildings in Towson University, where we're inviting artists local within the university and students to project different stories of folks that have been lost and stories that have been lost on actual architecture in Towson, in East Towson. The second year, we're focusing on discipline. How are professors and faculty actually dealing with the archive of their own institutions and their work? How are you dealing with the origin stories that are happening in your work? How does a department open up the canon for more voices that have been invisibilized in the way that we think about our fields of study? And in the third year, we're focusing on scholarship. What scholarship has come out of doing this archival and truth and reconciliation process? So you can go on to the next slide if you'd like. This is a huge little timeline here that I'm not going to go into every little detail about it. But as you can see, we're going to be working very closely with many different organizations and groups within the university to continue and keep perpetuating a conversation about archival history and inscribing and reinscribing voices from multiple perspectives. And the big thing is, you can go into the next slide, we need y'all. Hi, everyone who is sitting in this darn room. has something can contribute and something to say. We have multiple entry points for communities and activists and other scholars to become involved in this conversation and to utilize the resources that we have available and that we are building within the university to help with the continued truth and reconciliation work that is happening across Maryland and that the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project is trying to do. So please feel free to reach out to us. Please feel free to have further conversations about how we activate space. And I'm open to any kind of questions that you may have. And I'm sorry I ran through that fast, but I know that we're running behind on time. So I'm trying to be efficient. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's all good. Nancy, I know that you've been monitoring the chat for questions.
Yes, we have a couple of quick comments. Spice talks about when I went to find my history in Germany, where many relatives were murdered due to Hitler. I went to Dachau and felt the trees had the memory of the crematorium.
Yes, yes. Okay, I'm gonna be the hippie that I am, but we're all, nothing is static, right? We're all made of atoms. Our atoms are always moving and shaking. It makes some sense that when you touch a space, you put your hand down in the soil, that you're gonna feel the vibrations of that space, right? You're gonna feel the resonance that lives in the space. It's not just the cultural memory, it's literally the resonance of that energy that's been in that space. So yeah, that makes perfect sense to me.
And real fast, Peter Reiches also talks about how our challenges with voting rights and the redistricting maps also factor into your discussion of place.
Right.
Fair representation continues.
Definitely. One of the things that we're really trying to get into with sort of the archive, the historical archive of Towson University, is to have this conversation about how it's contributed to that, the shifting of the sort of politics and the borders of Baltimore County in the first place. I think about when the light rail was built in the 1990s and the hardcore efforts as a girl from West Baltimore who needed to travel around to make it so that Black people didn't go directly in to Towson, that you could work around Ruxton. What role did Towson University play in those conversations? Did it even step into those conversations, and if it contributed to those things? And this is the kinds of histories that we're trying to pull out and make very plain within the institution. And it could also explain why we have things like the White Student Union.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Young. It was spectacular, and we learned so much. And I know, Amy, you have a few announcements here before we get going, but I also did want to just take a moment to thank you, Amy, because you did all the heavy lifting in getting this thing organized. And I want to make sure people recognize that as well, that the spectacular work and tireless work that you did. So thank you.
Thank you, Will. And I just want to reiterate our appreciation to Dr. Young, Dr. Hathaway, and Dr. Aseltine for really framing our ongoing work that we started a couple years ago and are continuing. And now we really are digging into the conversations in order to reach the reconciliation and reckoning, and including and inviting community as we move forward. I also want to give appreciation to Izzy for her presentation of the original poem. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties on that one, as well as updates from Will Schwartz, Justice Prima, Troy Williams, and Nancy Goldring. Throughout this morning's impactful presentations, I was really reminded by each speaker about how we're surrounded by our history, and that we have a choice in how we choose to engage with that history and respond to it as we move forward. So our announcements are on the screen, just to highlight a couple. If you are interested in joining our work and maintaining communication with us, please reach out to the email that I think Sue is going to put in the chat one more time for us. It's our coalition email. We meet every month, the second Saturday of the month at 10 a.m., usually for about an hour and a half. Please feel free to attend our monthly anti-racism book discussions. They're held in partnership with the Baltimore County Public Library. They're held the third Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. Both coalition meetings and book discussions are virtual. The February 15th book event is going to be Passing by Nella Larson. And another reminder about the Maryland County Truth and Reconciliation Commission public hearing on June 4th. I want to reiterate again, asking your help to help publicize both the June 4th event as well as for folks who may have memory and history passed down through families, community members, and friends about the Howard Cooper lynching. Last, again, helping with publicizing the Racial Justice Poetry Contest. That information will be on the Baltimore County Coalition website. It should also be in the chat along with the press releases. Shortly later on today, you should receive a survey about the conference, our forum today. We are always looking for feedback to grow and expand our programming and our connections to community. Much appreciation to each of you for taking much time out of your day, engaging with these topics, and for your support of this important work. And I wish you a safe and healthy weekend. Thank you.